Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Who Knew? Today, you're in for a real treat as we have a wonderful interview lined up. Resident Susie Fraser will be interviewing her friend and neighbor, resident Connie Serota. Susie's actually going to do a more formal introduction, so I'll let her share all of Connie's fun facts with you. But first, I'd like to remind everyone that we are airing today's program live on TV 970, but as you know, we have a live audience too, so we'll be taking questions from you at the end of the interview. And one quick housekeeping note, would like to let you know that the Bob Cafaro recital that's in the Spiritual Center, or the Sanctuary tomorrow, is going to be at 3 o'clock p.m., not 3:30. There may have been a few posters with the incorrect time, so tomorrow's recital is at 3 o'clock. And now I'm going to turn it over to these gals so we can get to the main event.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Jordan, wherever you are, and also Jessica for your expertise and support in this process. We appreciate all of you. Also, we would like to thank Ann Archer. I believe Ann is here, who is the chair of the Who Knew Committee and has put together some 20 of these interviews this year, which we've all enjoyed, rewatching and watching live. Connie, we're thrilled to have you here today and to hear your life story. And thank you so much for putting the effort into the interview you have, including scanning and emailing images and information back and forth to me for the past 3 months. You're ahead of the curve technologically, just like you were ahead of the curve your entire life and continue to be. Also, we want to welcome Connie's friends and former neighbors and family members who have joined us here today, and give a shout out to her nephew, Kevin Carswell, who helped Connie put together her memoirs several years ago, and they were so helpful in putting together the questions. To the audience here live, and to you on 970, and to you on YouTube, we're glad you're here. Connie Serota is an inspiration to so many of us, but in case you don't know her, allow me to introduce you to this soft-spoken lady with the will of a general and the heart of a healer. Cornelia Ann Carswell Serota, Connie as we know her, was born in the bedroom community of Montclair, New Jersey. Until college years, she lived with her parents, her older brother Bruce, and her younger brother Jim in Montclair. During her elementary and secondary school years at the Kimberly School in Montclair, she participated in Girl Scouts, dancing school, piano lessons, and glee club. But her favorite activity was horseback riding, and she was a member of the Essex County Girls Mounted Troop. And you're seeing her in this picture on the left in the troop uniform, looking just as comfortable as a teenager in a uniform as she did as a commander in the Navy, and you see that picture on the right. The Girls Mounted Troop performed musical drills on horseback for the public in numerous arenas. They were taught how to groom, feed, and care for horses. They were taught horsemanship, including jumping. Connie performed in many parades and arenas, and she was also a bugler for the Girls Mounted Troop. She was one of 5 buglers who played the fanfare to introduce Ethel Merman's performance at the New York World's Fair in 1939. In May 1943, Connie received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. Just before graduation, she was sworn into the United States Navy. She served on active duty and in the Naval Reserve for 30 years, retiring as a commander. After World War II, between 1946 and 1950, Connie resumed civilian life, becoming one of the early employees of the United Nations, first in Paris, then at Lake Success on Long Island, and finally at the current facility on 42nd Street in New York City. In 1950, at the start of the Korean War, Connie returned to active duty in the Navy for 3 more years. On release from active duty, Connie became one of the first employees of the new National Security Agent, or NSA. She served there for 5 years. On May 19, 1958, Connie married Saul I. Serota, and here you're seeing them on a sailboat during their 2-year courtship. With marriage came a change in profession. Connie earned a Master of Arts degree in audiology from the University of Maryland, where she was hired to supervise in the audiology clinic and to teach clinical practice to graduate students. Saul continued his work as chief U.S. patent judge, while he and Connie shared many adventures in traveling, skiing, and raising Angus cattle on their farm in Fauquier County. In 2006, Connie and Saul moved here to Westminster, Canterbury, where Connie continues to live in their apartment in the courtyard. Jack and I are blessed to have gotten to know her as our wonderful next-door neighbor. And I dare say that after this interview, you will feel as honored as we do to know that your neighbor, Commander Connie Serota, is a bona fide national treasure. Connie, thank you. Connie, you can draw a crowd. I'm thinking that we should have charged admission to this.
And then have a party.
Do you fancy a few questions? Are you ready for a few questions?
I'm all ready.
Okay. Connie, you had a compelling reason to do this interview. Can you tell us what that was?
I was asked to do it by Ann Archer quite a while ago, and I told her I really didn't want to do it. But then I got to thinking there are very few World War II veterans left, and I only knew of a couple of them who live here. So people should be interested perhaps in what it was like to be in the military in World War II, and particularly to be a woman in the military, since women in the Navy were quite new. It was just starting out.
You're right. I checked with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and out of the 16 million people or Americans who served in World War II, we have fewer than 240,000 of them left, which means we should be honoring them, and it's great to be honoring you. We're going to talk a lot and focus on your career in the military, but Connie, you're from a very distinguished family, and they undoubtedly had a great influence on you. So I was hoping that we could touch some on your family, and we're looking at a picture of your father, with you on the left as a toddler, your little brother Jim on your father's lap, and your older brother Bruce. Can you tell us a little bit about growing up in Montclair in a, quote, bedroom community and your dad's influence?
A bedroom community was usually a town in New Jersey that was within commuting distance to New York City. And just about every adult male in the town was on the 806 every morning going to Hoboken and then taking the tube under the river to go to Manhattan for the day's work. Every man had a newspaper under his arm. And coming home, they had a different New York newspaper. This is the way we got our information. We had no TV, no radio. We even had the Montclair Times delivered to our home and the Newark Evening News. So we knew what was going on. But anyway, that was the kind of community that it was. My being in the middle between two brothers and being a girl, I think I was my father's favorite, but anyway, he was special to me. My two brothers I really loved and respected, and they were great as kids, and they grew up to be very well respected, very successful adults, and I admired them very much for that. My mother had a history in World War I, and she was in France as a canteen worker. In 1918, she was with the YMCA. The YMCA was attached to the 3rd Division, which was right up in the front lines in World War I. And as a canteen worker, she gave out hot chocolate and cigarettes to the men who were going into battle. She often, when she was in recreation, she had her violin with her, and she would play for the soldiers to sing in the evenings. And she also wrote letters for some who couldn't. So anyway, she was really a very good service woman, although a civilian at that time. So this was the experience I had of my mother.
We're looking at pictures of her, and I see a dichotomy there. On the left, she looks like she could step out of a Jane Austen novel, and on the right, she, as you explained, is on the front lines of World War I in France. Did she ever share any information with you children about those experiences, Connie?
We enjoyed our bedtime stories before bedtime, the three of us. And our favorite stories were those of her experience in France in 1918. I think our favorite story was the one where she was billeted in some not too pleasant place, and when she turned off the lights, she could hear the rats scrambling under her bed. So we did hear stories of her experience that way.
You know, I knew your mother before I ever met you, strangely enough. As a teenager, I won the I Dare You award, which was developed by William H. Danforth. And with the medal, we got a book called I Dare You. And the unforgettable heroine in that book was based on your mother's experiences in World War I, right?
Yes.
And so she was a hero of mine before you became a hero of mine. But William H. Danforth played a big role in her life, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. She really loved and respected him a lot. they had a very good relationship. My mother was there. There were only 2 women in this group, and he was their boss.
He was. And was he in France with her?
Was he?
Was Mr. Danforth with your mother in France?
Yeah, yes, definitely.
So he saw her in action in World War I. Fascinating. On the other hand, your mother was somewhat of a social butterfly, and I think she probably wanted you to be one, didn't she, Connie?
Yes, I didn't fit that mold very well, but she really wanted me to. And I think the picture that you have up there is in her first fancy dress. And it shows that she grew up in a home of luxury and privilege, and she gave this all up to serve in World War I.
A remarkable woman who obviously had a huge impact on you. You mentioned your brothers, and we're looking at the picture of you and Bruce and Jim. Jim has his hair long, like a little girl. It's a cute picture. You mentioned them before, and they have been an inspiration to you. Can you go a little further into why they were such an inspiration?
Each of the boys, when they were 4, had a bad disease. Jim had polio that left him paralyzed in his legs, and Bruce had encephalitis, and he was paralyzed on his left side. So growing up, they were kids. They were just like every other kid, and they weren't held back at all by these problems. And as adults, they have very successful careers and very successful lives. And I admired them so much for that.
So they didn't let the illness or the side effects define them at all.
Exactly.
That is admirable. Well, your maternal grandparents had an impact on you too. The Dixons, they had 2 major properties. One was in Montclair. It was a mansion called the Wild House. And they had an estate in Littleton, New Hampshire, which we're seeing on the screen with 2 barns. And right beside that, we're seeing Connie's Serota on a pony, bareback. Can you talk a little bit about the influences, especially of your grandfather and the houses?
Well, my grandfather loved poetry and inspired me to learn poems that still stick with me. He also, I enjoyed playing duets on the piano with him. He also played the cello, so we had some sessions with my mother on her violin and him on his cello and me on the piano. Didn't sound great, but it was fun, and I enjoyed that experience. At the farm, we were there with cousins. We had a number of cousins, and it was a wonderful place to spend the summer with our ponies. Every family had a pony, and we never did use saddles. You could just slip the bridle on the horse and be off. We also enjoyed the farm not helping, that's in quotes, the farmers and what they were doing. When haying season was there, we enjoyed helping. Early in the morning, I would run down to the barn, and the cows were being brought in for milking. We fed the calves, and bottle fed the cows if they were weaned. And it was just a lovely farm life that I enjoyed tremendously.
Is that where you got your love for animals?
I don't know, maybe that was instinctive. We always had dogs in our house.
Yes.
And I did learn that cows are very nice, gentle animals. And that was that experience.
What a remarkable family. It seems like an idyllic upbringing that you had. Well, shall we move on to your service as a U.S. Naval officer, Connie? I think you wanted to focus some on that today.
Yes.
We're seeing a picture of the Catalina, which I know you'll get into in this, but can you tell us the circumstances that led to your service in the U.S. Navy?
I was a junior in college. And on a December Sunday afternoon, all of a sudden, all of us who were studying in our rooms, we were suddenly out in the hallway asking each other, where is this place called Pearl Harbor? Nobody had ever heard of Pearl Harbor. And then people were talking about war, since our parents, the previous generation, had experienced World War I. So we were scared to have that prospect in front of us. So the next year, I was a senior in the spring of '43, and the Navy was looking for some women to be a new group within the Navy. And they had a recruiter come to Smith. They came to the other women's colleges, Vassar, Wellesley, Mount Holyoke, and probably others outside of New England, I don't know. But this interviewer asked, the first question was, are you engaged to be married? Well, if you said yes to that, that was the end of the interview. And then they asked you if you'd studied languages. They asked if you liked crossword puzzles and things like that. So I said yes, they said yes, and I was sworn in April. I graduated in May, and 31st of July I was on active duty. That was 43.
What was the training like for that, Connie?
My first day on active duty was physical exam. And this was in Northampton, Massachusetts. It was in a big building at the other end of the town. And I remember a great big open floor where when we came in, they said, take off all your clothes except your underwear and your shoes. And then we were given, each one had a big, like a big bath towel to keep you warm. And all around this big room, there were various stations where every piece of your anatomy was checked out. And you had a piece of paper that you checked off every place you went to. The last place I went to was the blood draw. As a child, I often fainted in the doctor's office, particularly if somebody came near me with a needle. So here I was in blood draw. The corpsman who was doing it saw me looking wobbly, and he said, go sit in that chair and put your head between your knees and we'll get to you later. Well, in the old days, when I was a child and I fainted, I got revived with smelling salts and TLC. But the Navy doesn't do much TLC. So I sat there and shivered in my towel for the longest time. And then they finally got my blood, and I went home just about everybody had left by then. So that was my first experience in the Navy.
You passed the physical, though, right?
I passed. So the next step was basic training, and that was also in Northampton. And they had only 6 weeks to get us to know everything we needed to know about the Navy, like where were the naval districts, where were the various fleets at sea, what was the hierarchy, who was the CNO, and some history too, which was the dying captain who said, "Don't give up the ship." The difference between "yes, sir," and "aye, aye, sir." And these important things. Our teachers were pretty much people who had just graduated before us. And they were mostly people our age. There were some older women, as much as 35 years old, who were our teachers also. One of the activities, and I guess the Navy planned this to get us to have some exercise. There was a big field nearby, and every day we went out to this field and marched. And we marched a lot. We were told when we bought our Navy shoes that we should get size larger than what we usually used, because our feet would grow, and they did. But anyway, we marched up and down, and to keep the pace right, we sang. And one of the songs I remember that we sang was the Weeping Mother's Song. And the words were, "Don't make my girl a sailor," the weeping mother said. "Make her a whack or send her back to typing school instead. She's always been a home girl. She's never been to sea. A man in every port is not the life she learned from me." So we also
Brilliant.
sang "Anchors Aweigh," "Off in the Wild Blue Yonder," from the halls of Montezuma. This was all part of our education that we needed to know as naval officers. Our last day was graduation. We got one very important stripe on our sleeve. I remember when we left graduation, everybody should have a wad of $1 bills in their pockets, because when you're walking down the street and an enlisted man comes along and you give your first return salute, that man is entitled to $1. And some of these enterprising young sailors were out on the street collecting their dollar bills. So that was the end of basic training. Then we had another 6 weeks of communication school in the same place, the same classrooms, the same barracks. And in 6 weeks they taught us a lot about security, about classified information, and I would never say this back in those days, the verboten word encryption, decryption, but that's basically what we were learning. So I think one memorable day, I received a birthday cake from my mother. And here I was, this important ensign in the U.S. Navy, and she was treating me as a little girl because she wanted to recognize my 21st birthday. Oh. So my friends and I ate the cake, but I hope I was properly appreciative to my mother, but I was really embarrassed by it.
Oh.
So that was the end of my training.
So then you went to your first duty station.
And that was, I had requested West Coast because growing up on the East Coast, I had like a dream to go to the West Coast. And sure enough, I got it. Naval Air Station, San Diego. And that was a wonderful place to be assigned because from San Diego, really the war in the Pacific was being launched. There were other places, but I think San Diego was the main place. And the air station was on North Island, which is an island off of San Diego. An adjacent island was Coronado Island. And they had ships coming in there, the big carriers, the CVs, and the baby carriers, the CVEs, and other ships as well. And of course there were a lot of flights. As new people on the base, we were often asked to go up on a plane. And you say the plane is a picture up here?
The Catalina,
That was the first.
PB-5.
That was the first plane I ever flew in. It's a patrol bomber. It flies high and slow. It's also amphibian. And so I got to ride in this. It was my first plane ride. And we took off on the runway and we landed in the water at the end of the flight.
Oh, my.
So it was an intentional water landing. But I flew in a lot of other different planes. When the pilots wanted to go up for airtime practice in the air, they would often ask you to come along. So I flew in a lot of different kinds of planes. One I remember particularly was a TBM torpedo bomber. That wasn't too great because you couldn't see much. But anyway,
you flew in a B-17, didn't you?
the other thing that was a program they had, I don't know what its official name was, but we called it hitchhiking by air. And if you were stationed far from home and you had to go home on leave, and if you went by train, it's like 5 days across the country, 5 days back, there goes your leave time. Or if you chose to fly, there goes your month's salary. So the Navy had this program where you go to an air base and check in with the dispatcher and tell them where you want to go. And you sit and wait until there's a plane going where you want to go, or at least in the direction where you want to go. Sometimes it would take a couple of flights to get to the East Coast. But the other thing that was of interest, that when you got on the plane, you had to check out a parachute. And it was a parachute packed in a package about so big. And we had to carry that with us. And we gave it back when we landed where we were, our destination. None of us hitchhikers, and usually there were 2 or 3 others that were hitchhiking with you, none of us would have known what to do, even to open this case, let alone know what to do with a parachute if you got to it. And I have no idea why the Navy or the other services required this parachute. But anyway, I did get to fly in a lot of different airplanes because 3 years in California, there was a lot of opportunities to go home. And often it was, I remember at least 2 trips, I had a regular seat in a passenger plane. But a couple of times it was a big empty cargo plane, and you maybe sat on your parachute or you lie down and use it as a pillow. And so those were not the best. But, you know, it was taking us where we wanted to go. I flew in a B-26. I remember that one. Had a accident on the runway with the tire blew out. But anyway, the most exciting plane was the B-17, and the pilot asked if I wanted to fly in the nose. And the nose, as most people know, is all glass. And you have sky above you, below you, and all around you. And that was so exciting.
That must have been.
And we flew through an electrical storm just to see the lightning way up in the sky.
Oh.
So this was a lot of my experience in airplanes, was going back and forth across the country.
Well, you moved to a second duty station, Connie, and we're looking at a picture of it, the entrance to Holtville, and also you and the only other woman on that base in front of the administration building. Can you tell us a little bit about that assignment, please?
Naval Air Station San Diego started some auxiliary air bases around the city at some distance, 100 miles or more around. I think there were about 5 of them, and Holtville was just one of these 5. And the purpose being to serve as a base for pilots to come and practice their landings and takeoffs on the desert. Holtville was in the Imperial Valley. At that time it was really hot desert. It was a hardship post. Lois Barr and I were assigned there. I really felt honored that the Navy felt we were reliable enough to be able to handle ourselves in a remote place like that. When we arrived, the only other woman on the base was the civilian telephone operator. And there were a lot of the pilots that came in, they were kept to themselves pretty much. They had their own facilities. The base was run by just a few officers, and the commanding officer was difficult. The executive officer was alcoholic. The operations officer, he was all right. The chaplain was the best of the bunch. He was a nice young man. So these were the people that ran the base. And I had a problem with the commanding officer. He had, I don't know if it was his sense of humor or whether he had some kind of a resentment of women officers in the Navy. But anyway, he assigned each of us collateral duties. I was assigned duty as legal officer, and my second collateral duty was officer in charge of the bar, because I wasn't a drinker, and he thought his bottles would be safe with me inventorying them periodically, and nobody would take them. So as a legal officer, that's where I got into trouble. A young sailor had gone on liberty with his roommate's blouse that had a stripe on it that was more than he was entitled to. So the commanding officer, there are not too many legal proceedings. There's captain's mast, where it's a tete-a-tete with the captain. There's the deck court, then there's summary court-martial, then general court-martial. So the captain decided it would be a deck court. He called me into his office and said, "I expect this man to be reduced in his rate." And in other words, he was telling me how the court should go. The court was run by the deck court officer. So there were two of us and the offending sailor. Both the deck court officer and I felt the reduction of his rating was too severe for what he had done. He was simply going on leave and trying to impress a girlfriend. And so at the deck court, we decided on a punishment very much less than the reduction of his rate. The court proceedings were over, and a sailor came to me and said, "The captain wants to see you." So I went into his office, and his eyes were blazing. He was furious. And there's not a whole lot of punishments that he can give to officers under his command, but one is to put you in hack. So I had 2 days of that. And that means you stay in your quarters, you go out just to mess hall, and the deck court officer got the same punishment. So whenever either one of us arrived at the mess hall, we were heroes to everybody because they were sympathetic to this sailor, and they knew he was a very unpopular commanding officer. In fact, the sailors called, his initials were SB. They called him SOB, Pearl. So,
well, that area was very remote, and there wasn't a lot to do. So didn't you purchase another horse to have
the only entertainment at Naval Auxiliary Air Station, Holtville, was to go to the officers' club in the evening and drink. Fortunately, they had a pool table, and I got pretty good at pool. But I felt that I needed something more than that for recreation. And this telephone operator had a friend who lived in Holtville who had a horse for sale. So one day Lois and I went into Holtville. It was several miles, like 3 or 4 miles away. And we saw this horse, and I decided I would get the horse. So the owner put it in a truck and brought it over to us. The sailors, they had some extra lumber lying around, and they created a shelter for my horse. It was a bay mare, quarter horse.
We're seeing a picture of you with the horse on the screen right now.
And so you couldn't, during the day you couldn't go out. But in the evening it was lovely to ride out on the desert. And you see the purple mountains in the distance, and there were all kinds of wildlife that came out in the evenings. There were great big jackrabbits. There were snakes and the tarantulas. And I remember one sailor once caught a tarantula, put a string around one of his legs, and walked him like a pet dog, walked him around the base, scaring everybody. But tarantulas weren't really that dangerous. The dangerous ones were the scorpions. And the scorpions would hide in dark places. So you never put your hand in a dark place unless you know what's there. So anyway, it was enjoyable. Oh, the other thing, the commanding officer decided that this was a good recreation for the enlisted men, and so he bought a whole stable full of horses. There were probably 6 or 8 horses. And he thought this would look good on his record, that he was doing something for morale for the people in his command. So that was even better, because I had people to ride with. And the sailors enjoyed it too.
Oh, they must have. What a positive way to handle the situation too.
Well, it worked out for me.
It sure did. Well, the end of the war came, But it seems like after World War II, it was just the beginning for you of some leading edge professional experiences, Connie. The first one being with the newly charted United Nations. Can you tell us about your 3 positions there, please?
Well, it started because I got a job as a private secretary to the UN General Assembly in Paris in '48. And that was a dream come true. 3 months in Paris. And the reason I got the job, the woman I was working for was a friend of the family, and she just wanted to give me this opportunity. She really didn't need a secretary. But anyway, I would go to meetings of the General Assembly in the Palais des Nations and sit in the balcony, take notes, and type them up later and give them to her. But looking down from my balcony seat on the stage were people like Trygve Lie, who was the first Secretary General of the UN, and people, I think it was Gromyko from Russia. But anyway, it was a thrilling job, but it wasn't a very arduous job. In fact, Mrs. Fradkin that I worked for had a friend who was doing pretty much the same thing she was. So she shared me with him, and he had some things he wanted typed up, so I did that.
You then went on to Long Island, didn't you, with the UN?
That's
when
right.
You got back?
Yes, well, I better tell you a little more about what went on in Paris. I was in a rooming house just off the Champs-Élysées, near the Arc de Triomphe, a wonderful location. But it was an old house that was a mansion in the old days. It was now a kind of a low-class rooming house. And I got a room on the top floor, a small single room, but it looked out on the rooftops of Paris, and that was so exciting.
Oh, it must have been.
And there was only one other room on the top floor, and there were 3 women who worked with the Secretariat. And we got to be good friends. They had a hot plate that they weren't supposed to have. This was right after the war, and electricity was expensive, and the management of the place was trying to be very careful that it wasn't used by the residents. But anyway, this hot plate, my friends kept hidden in a locked suitcase under a bed. So, but anyway, one of the things that happened, do we have time for this story?
Well, we can, but we might have to switch. We might have to skip over a couple of things. We want to get to Saul,
All right,
but
we can save
go
that
ahead.
story for last.
No, I don't want to interrupt your fun because it's a funny story.
Okay, well, I had met a young Frenchman, and he invited me to go to a movie. And my friends on the top floor said, when you come back with Jacques, come upstairs and we'll have some hot chocolate. And so we came back from the movie into the lobby, and sure enough, Madame, the owner, was there at the desk. When we headed for the elevator, she said, "You're not going upstairs with that young man." So we had a conversation about it, and I was really handicapped because I couldn't say anything about hot chocolate because that implied hot plate. So we argued for a while, and her French was much better than mine. So the result of the incident was that Jacques went home, and I went up in the elevator by myself for the hot chocolate. The next day, in my box, was a notice that I was to leave the premises by nightfall, by the end of the day. So I had to go and find another cheap, roomy house and move all my stuff, which I did. And that was all right, except I missed my friends. It was very nice where I was. And I felt really put upon because, first of all, it wasn't my hot plate that the management knew was being used. And I was just an innocent bystander. But I think Madame was happy to get rid of one of her troublesome American girls.
Scandalous, Connie, scandalous.
Pardon?
Scandalous.
It was scandalous, yes. In Paris, yeah. But anyway.
Well,
then when I came back, I was intrigued by the idea of joining the United Nations. There was a lot of optimism about it in those days, that wars would not happen anymore. Of course, we know how that worked out. Of course, the UN does a lot of other very good things, but I was hired and went to Lake Success. I was in an office of volunteer services where foreign diplomats coming to the United States who wanted to meet Americans, we arranged social events like dinner parties and sometimes weekends and things like that. So that was the office where but there was a lot of competition for jobs. So the only job I could get was secretary. And so I worked there for a year, and that was 1950. And the Korean War broke out. I knew that I was well trained for what they needed, so I was recalled voluntarily to active duty in 1950. So that time, I was sent to Washington, D.C.
And you served there for 3 years.
I was at the Naval
Korean
Security
War.
Station at Ward Circle, and working watches, as I had always done. The watches are 8 to 4, 4 to 12, 12 to 8. So these were alternating with others.
That job took you directly into the National Security Agency, too, where you served again for several years,
Yes.
correct?
Well, I was not retired, but I left active duty in 53, and I was immediately employed by NSA because they needed people in the same kind of work.
Yes.
And actually, I went back to the same desk I had in the Navy at the same place. But then NSA had a big building out at Fort Meade where they moved to, and I didn't want to commute. And we had a house in Chevy Chase. Am I getting ahead of the story?
Actually, you're right on time. The picture of you and Saul at the White House is in front of us. And I think that if we miss talking about Saul, you may be pretty upset. Maybe we should talk about him and your relationship and your marriage.
I met him at the sailing marina in Alexandria. I had just gotten a boat. It wasn't a new boat, a second-hand boat. I was painting the bottom of the boat with anti-fouling paint. And the directions on the paint can said, put the boat in the water 45 minutes after you finish painting. So along came 2 young men. And I said, pardon me, can you tell me what time it is? And of course he thought that was a pickup. So I really wanted to know what time it was. But the result was that they helped me put this boat in the water. And they had been Don and Saul had been looking for a boat for recreation to either buy or rent. So I needed a crew. This was a 19-foot Lightning class boat, sailed every Sunday. And so they crewed with me. And we did pretty well with our boat in the races. Saul took to it pretty well, Don not so well. But anyway, we started dating, and that one thing led to another, so.
Well, Saul had a very distinguished career, and he had 2 presidential appointments, I believe, correct?
Yes. In 1970, Richard Nixon appointed him examiner-in-chief at the Patent Office. Saul was never political, and so often these jobs go to people who are big donators. But he got it on his own skill and competence in his what he was doing.
Yes.
And he loved what he was doing. This is the thing he really enjoyed. And then the second appointment was Ronald Reagan appointed him as chief patent judge, the first patent judge. Sometime earlier, I guess it was when we were invited to the White House, and these presidential appointees, they had to be appointed with the advice and consent of the Senate. So these presidential appointees, a bunch of them were invited to the White House for a dinner and dance, and that was that occasion.
I see. And when this was taken during the Ford administration, and I believe you danced with the president and Saul
Yes.
danced with the first lady.
Right.
It's a wonderful
Gerald
picture.
Ford. So.
Well, Connie, we're coming up with only a few minutes left, and we've covered not nearly all that we had planned to. But if we may end up, some of you in the audience may not know, and you probably won't believe, that Connie is legally blind. And she is an amazingly independent. If you're ever in her apartment, I think she would invite all of you to come. It's like being in the cockpit of an airplane, and watching her get around technology is a sight indeed. She's also going to be celebrating a very special birthday on September 8th. It will be her 100th birthday. And I think that qualifies her to give some advice to our children and grandchildren. Would you be willing to do that for us, Connie, as we end?
Well, looking back on what I did, I would suggest to young people starting out to be sure whatever you get into is something that you really can put your heart and soul into, something that you feel is important. And I was lucky that I was always able to do that. Things fell my way. So I do think it's so important not to just have a job, but have a job that you really care about. And the only thing with me that I didn't plan very well, and I think young people planning their lives should do a better job than I did. Things just happened. They just fell the way they fell.
Well, you have had a fabulous life, and you have been so generous in sharing some of it with us today. We're not going to have time for questions, I don't believe.
We're cutting it pretty close, so I don't think so, but I think Connie would probably invite any of you all to ask her questions afterwards or in the hall or as you see her around campus, because there's a lot more to this story. So, well, thank you all. And Connie, thank you so much, and thank you for your service and for being here today to share just a snippet of your life with us. But I know we didn't capture all of that almost 100 years, so I would encourage our audience and our staff members also to ask questions as they come about. But this has been wonderful, so thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. And thank you to Susie, because she did a great job in analyzing my story and putting it together.
She really did.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you.